On the table lay a folded slip of paper, the blue ink smudged at the corner as if someone had written it in haste and left it behind before thinking better of it. I opened it, read each word, and a coldness ran down my spine. Going on a Caribbean cruise with Eric, the ex, and mother. You stay to take care of Arthur. He needs you. No explanation, no apology, no promise of when they would return. Only a cold command, as if I were an unwilling house servant. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what I had just read. The faint, musty scent of the old house hung in the air, not the smell of roast turkey or pumpkin pie I had pictured on the drive, more than 6 hours from Santa Fe to Denver. The trunk of my car was full of gifts wrapped in red paper and bags of ingredients: sweet potatoes, fresh cranberries, flour for apple pies, ready for a crowded Thanksgiving gathering we had planned weeks ago. But when I opened this door, what greeted me was not laughter, a football game playing on TV, or the busy rhythm of knives and cutting boards in the kitchen. The house was cold, as if the heat had been turned off the day before. Gray November light slipped through the curtains, stretching shadows across the wooden floor. In the living room, Arthur, Claire's stepfather, sat alone in a brown leather armchair, leaning slightly as if listening for something in the silence. He wore a cardigan frayed at the hem, his thin hands resting on the armrests. His hair was silver, sparse but neatly kept, and his gray eyes fixed on me, sharp and alert. I had heard Claire describe him as a frail man who needed careful attention and had difficulty walking. But this gaze did not belong to someone who had given up. Arthur tilted his chin toward the note on the table, as if he knew I had just finished reading it. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but a knowing trace of irony. "They left you with the burden, didn't they?" he said, his voice rough but clear, enough to fill the space between us. I set the bags of gifts on the sofa and slowly shrugged off my heavy coat. "Seems that way," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady even as my heart pounded faster. On the drive from Santa Fe that morning, I had pictured meeting Claire at the door, being pulled into the kitchen where her mother and Arthur were talking, the smell of dinner filling the air. Instead, I was standing in an empty house, in front of a man I had never spoken to for more than 10 minutes at any holiday, holding a note telling me my wife was on vacation with her ex. I stepped into the kitchen. The wooden table was bare, not a single plate or glass. The sink held a few dirty mugs with dried coffee rings. The refrigerator hummed quietly, holding only half a carton of milk, a wilted bag of salad, and a few unidentifiable leftovers. There was no sign of preparations for a feast or of anyone returning in the next few hours. I went back to the living room. Arthur was still there, gently rocking in his chair, his eyes never leaving me. "When are they coming back?" I asked, partly to fill the silence, partly to hear him confirm it. "Sunday, unless something changes in their cruise schedule," he said. He then gave a short laugh without an ounce of joy. I let out a dry chuckle, unable to find another word but bitter. Support. That was the word Claire used whenever she needed me to drop work to attend a family meeting or help her mother move. But this was different. This was not just an inconvenient request. This was a plan. Outside, the Denver wind hissed through the bare trees, rattling the windows as if to underline the isolation of this house. I looked at Arthur longer, trying to read the unspoken meaning behind his eyes. He did not seem angry or surprised. Instead, there was a strange calm, as if he was used to these sudden disappearances. I drew a deep breath, catching the mix of dry dust and old wood. In my head, questions began lining up. Why had Claire said nothing beforehand? Why go with Eric, the man she had sworn she had cut off? And her mother, whose side was she on in all this? Arthur suddenly leaned back, his gaze still locked on mine. "What are you going to do with Lucas? Stay here for 4 days, making porridge and pouring tea for me?" I stayed silent. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, drive back to Santa Fe, and abandon all of this. But another part, the one that had endured years of condescending glances and quiet insults from my wife's family, wanted to stay. Not to care for him on their orders, but to see for myself what was happening here. I sat in the chair opposite him, my hands clasped, feeling the cold from the floor creep up my legs. "For now, I'll stay," I said. And for the first time since I walked in, Arthur truly smiled. Arthur's kitchen was still quiet as I began putting groceries into the refrigerator. The bags of sweet potatoes and fresh cranberries looked small against the cold, empty expanse of the stainless steel shelves. My hand brushed the metal edge, and memory pulled me back to the early years of my marriage. The years when I still believed Claire and I were a team, when every decision felt like it was for both of us. 7 years earlier, we had met at a photography exhibition in Albuquerque. Claire was a guest of a mutual friend. She stood in front of a black and white photograph I had taken of the Chihuahuan desert at sunset, tilting her head as if she were having a quiet conversation with the light in the frame. We talked until the gallery closed. Claire was magnetic, quick-witted, and had a way of asking questions that made me feel my work mattered more than it truly did. When we married, I already had a small studio in Santa Fe where I shot commercial projects and occasionally worked on personal ones. My income was uneven but enough to live on, and most importantly, I was independent. Only a few months after the wedding, Claire began suggesting we could save money if I moved my work home. You don't need to pay rent for a studio just to edit photos. You could shoot in the guest room, use it as a temporary studio, she said, her tone carrying the weight of an obvious truth. I agreed. At first, I thought it was a way for us to be closer, to save on monthly expenses. But clients soon noticed I no longer had a professional space to meet them. The meetings dwindled. My work shifted to small events and editing photos for other people. I was at home more often, and Claire spent more time at work or with her family. The change went beyond my work. From the start, whenever her family gathered, for birthdays, holidays, or even just Sunday dinners, I was usually the last to know. Sometimes Claire had already agreed to a date with her mother and siblings before mentioning it to me, as if to say, "Oh, by the way, you can come if you want." Many times I showed up with a bottle of wine or a homemade dessert, only to be met with polite nods while the conversation revolved entirely around their shared history, the kind of stories I could never join. One Christmas, I remember clearly, I was standing at the sink washing dishes when I heard her mother say to an aunt, "Lucas is fine. He's just not used to how our family does things." They didn't know I could hear them, and when I asked Claire about it later, she brushed it off. Don't pay attention. She didn't mean anything by it, but all those moments of not meaning anything stacked up into a wall between me and them. I became the outsider in my own family. Money only widened the gap. Claire had a steady marketing job with a regular paycheck. My income depended on projects and contracts. She often compared me to her friends' husbands. See Mark? He works in banking, always busy but stable. Or Ben? He bought his wife a house after just 2 years of marriage. Each time I forced a smile, but inside it left a slow, stinging cut. In our 4th year of marriage, my father died at 74. He had been a carpenter all his life, leaving little behind but an old house and a savings account with $40,000. I had planned to use that money to expand my studio, rent a new space, and invest in better equipment. Claire persuaded me otherwise. "We should think long-term," she said, sitting at the dining table with her hands resting on a stack of budget papers. "If we put it into the joint account, along with my savings, we can make a down payment on a house by the end of the year. You don't want us renting forever, do you?" She was right in one way. I wanted stability too, and I believed it was our shared goal. So I agreed, transferring all $40,000 into the joint account without asking for a separate note or any paperwork. We did not buy a house that year. The next year, Claire said the market wasn't right, then that we needed more to reach the ideal down payment. I was tied up with work and caring for my mother in Santa Fe, so I didn't press. By the time I looked closely, the account balance no longer reflected that money. Claire gave a vague explanation that it had been used temporarily for family expenses, promising to replace it later. I didn't push, partly out of exhaustion, partly out of fear of straining the marriage. I chose silence, telling myself things would balance out. But the truth was, the more I gave way, the further I was pushed from being an equal. In recent years, Claire began showing her lack of respect right in front of me. When friends came over, she would say, "Lucas works from home, so he's got plenty of free time." Or when I questioned a purchase, she would reply, "You don't earn like others do, so don't compare." At first I argued, but eventually I learned to stay quiet. Arguments never ended in compromise. They ended with her angry and me finding a way to smooth things over. I remember one night last summer, we had dinner with her mother and Eric, whom Claire introduced as an old college friend. I sat there listening to them share stories and trips I had never been part of. When the bill came, Eric took it, and Claire laughed. "He's always more gallant than you." Then she turned to me and added, "Just kidding." But the looks around the table told me no one saw it as a joke. I had tried to set all of that aside when I drove to Denver this morning. I thought Thanksgiving would be a chance to connect, to sit together at the same table, to, just once, feel like I belonged. But the cold note on the table, the empty house, and Arthur's knowing gaze told me plainly, I had never truly belonged here. Standing now in his kitchen, I realized the past 7 years had not been a string of small disagreements. They were a series of moments pushing me to the edge, moments I let slide for the sake of peace, moments when Claire chose her family even if it meant taking what was mine. And in this silence, for the first time, I saw it. I had been in a one-sided relationship for far too long. Arthur motioned for me to sit in the chair across from him. The living room was already cold, but his voice carried a different kind of chill, the kind born of years of exhaustion and bitterness held in. He did not waste words. "You know why they left you here, Lucas? It is not because they trust you. They did it because they think you will obediently handle the dirty work they do not want to touch." I had not yet answered when he continued. "For years I have grown used to being left behind, treated like an old object left in a corner, glanced at only when someone has time. My medication has been cut to half doses because Elaine said the doctor overprescribed. Every time I have a checkup, they complain about the pudding, then cut out the medicines I truly need." His tone never shifted, but I could feel the anger simmering under the calm. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "You know, I once fell in the yard. It was a weekend. Brady was home, but the door was locked, and no one answered when I called. Turns out he was watching football with headphones on. A neighbor had to help me up." Arthur lifted his gaze, his eyes sharpening. "They know how to keep me alive just long enough, but never how to let me live well." I stayed quiet, letting him speak. There was something in the way he told it that made me realize how many signs I had missed over the years. In the brief family gatherings I had attended, I had assumed he was being well cared for, but it was only a picture they had staged. "Last month, the doctor gave me the final news," Arthur said, as if dropping a stone into still water. "Pancreatic cancer, final stage. They gave me at most 6 months, realistically 3, maybe less." He said it so lightly that it took me a few seconds to believe what I had heard. I exhaled slowly. "Claire, she knows about this. She knows. Brady knows. Her mother knows." They all sat in the room when the doctor said it, and 2 days later, they were discussing a cruise to relieve stress. "You see, I am the reason they need a vacation." Arthur rose, moving slowly but with purpose toward the hallway. Well, I heard the click of a small lock. When he returned, he was carrying an old steel document box with a label that read private. He set it on the coffee table, turned the key, and lifted the lid. Inside were bundles of files bound with rubber bands, sealed envelopes, and a leather-bound notebook. He laid them out one by one: a will in a clear plastic sleeve, the deed to a house in Colorado Springs, bank books, and statements from an offshore account. My eyes froze on the numbers. "You have more than $4 million, Arthur nodded. 4.3 million, to be exact. This includes the Colorado Springs property, an investment portfolio I have built since my banking years, and a foreign account. None of them knows the full picture. They think I only have this house and a pension, the one they are quietly draining." He pulled the will back toward himself. "This is the real one, written 2 years ago before I realized how bad things were. Back then, most of it went to Elaine and Brady, with a small portion to charities. Now it will be different. I want to rewrite it completely." I looked at him, unable to hide my doubt. "Why are you telling me this?" "I am just," he cut in, his tone firm. "They think you are just the doorman. I think you are an ally." He let that hang in the air long enough for me to feel its weight. "Lucas, I need you to help me set everything straight. We will gather evidence of neglect, of the money they have taken, of how they have used both you and me. All of it will go into a legal record. I have a trusted lawyer, Patricia, who will rewrite the will, establish trusts, and make sure they cannot touch a cent." I leaned back, my mind spinning. The practical part of me reminded me that this was his family's matter, not mine. But another part, the part that had endured 7 years of quiet contempt from my wife's family, began to see this as a chance to turn the tables. Arthur went on, as if reading my hesitation. I cannot do this alone. My strength will not allow it. I need someone here to watch, to record, and to be ready to stand in front of them when the time comes. You have been dismissed by them before. You know how that feels. This is not only revenge. This is about protecting what should go to those who deserve it. I swallowed the dry taste in my throat. If I agree, where do you want to start? Start with the truth, Arthur said, placing the leather notebook into my hands. Here are my notes from the past 2 years, dates when medication was skipped, amounts of money taken, and times I was left alone, names of witnesses, neighbors' phone numbers. We will verify everything, photograph it, and archive it. When they come back, it will all be laid in front of them. I flipped through a few pages. His handwriting was clear, each entry as precise as an incident report. March 14th, morning dose skipped. Elaine said not needed yet. July 22nd, $1,500 withdrawn from joint account. Note said medical expenses, but no new medication purchased. September 5th, fell in the yard, no one home. Mrs. Daniels helped. I looked up. Arthur was watching me, his gaze steady, without a flicker of doubt. They will think I am weak, that I do not remember. But we will show them. I remember very well. Outside, the wind slammed branches against the wall. I felt as though I stood at a crossroads. One path was to step back and let things go on as before. The other was to step into a game where the reward was not only money, but truth brought into the light. I need time to think, I said, though the answer was already clearer than I wanted to admit. Arthur only nodded. You have the night, but remember, my time is short, and an opportunity like this will not come again. He stood, gathered the documents back into the box, locked it, and carried it to his room. When his figure disappeared behind the door, I was still sitting there, my hand resting on the leather notebook. I thought of every time Claire had shut me out of plans, every belittling comparison, every dollar I had placed into the joint account and never saw again. In that moment, I understood why Arthur had chosen me. Not because I was the best choice, but because I was the only one still here. When Arthur returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs of hot tea, he set one in front of me. So, Lucas, he said, his voice low but carrying something like an invitation, shall we begin? I looked into the eyes that had endured years of disregard and saw my own eyes reflected back. I gave a small nod. Begin. The next morning, as the gray Denver light slipped through the curtains, Arthur already had a to-do list laid out on the dining table. His handwriting was steady, unshaken, as if the illness had yet to touch his hands. If we want them to believe I am barely hanging on, he said, we will have to show them that in our way. We started with Arthur's bedroom. Once neat and simple, with a single bed and a dark wooden dresser, it now had to look like the living space of a man in rapid decline. Arthur called an old friend in the medical field, someone who used to run a home care equipment rental store. By afternoon, a small, unmarked truck stopped in front of the house, delivering a mechanical hospital bed, an oxygen tank, an IV stand, and a few monitors, including a fake pacemaker. I positioned the bed right by the window so that the dim light would emphasize the pallor of Arthur's skin. He gave a faint smirk as I adjusted the angle. I look more like a patient already, he said with a trace of irony in his voice. Next came the props for photos and video. I used my photography skills to work the lighting, casting shadows into his eye sockets and bringing out the lines in his face. Arthur removed his glasses, tousled his hair, and pulled a thin blanket over himself to reveal his frailty. I took shot after shot, him lying with eyes closed, hands resting on his chest, him gazing distantly out the window, him slumping forward as if struggling to breathe. We sent these photos one by one to Melissa, Claire's younger sister, along with brief, carefully toned messages mixing calm with concern. Arthur could not sleep last night. This morning he was short of breath, needed oxygen. The doctor says we have to monitor him closely. Each time, Melissa replied with pitiful comments like, poor thing, or I will tell her, but never once did anyone call directly. That afternoon, I moved to the harder part, calls to report a critical turn. I knew Brady, Claire's brother, usually kept his phone on auto forward to voicemail. When I called Claire, I also recorded the call on my phone. My voice had to sound tense, but not overly dramatic. It's me. Arthur is much weaker now. The doctor says if you want to see him, you should come soon. Her reaction chilled me. A sigh, then her voice was quick and impatient. We are in the middle of the trip, you know that. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just give him his meds like usual. She hung up before I could say more. I saved that recording in a private folder, labeled Evidence Audio 01. Arthur listened to it, nodding once. We will need a few more like that. And so, over the next 2 days, I called at different times, capturing the same response each time: detachment and reluctance to return. Word of Arthur's failing health began to spread in the neighborhood, not from his family, but from the neighbors themselves. Mrs. Daniels from across the street was the first to stop by with a tray of apple pie. "I heard Arthur is doing poorly," she whispered when I opened the door. Sitting at the table, she recalled seeing him fall in the yard last summer and needing to call her husband to help him up. Brady was home, she said, but the doors were locked and no one answered, no matter how hard she knocked. I noted every detail, asking if I could record her words so I could remember them clearly. She agreed without hesitation. The next day, Mr. Peterson from down the street brought over some chicken soup, telling me he had once seen Elaine arrive home with bags full of shopping right after withdrawing money from Arthur's account. She said it was for medicine, but I only saw shoeboxes and handbags. Evidence from the neighbors piled up in my recorder and notebook. Each account was numbered, dated, and photographed with the witness's consent, not only for proof, but so the lawyer could call on them if needed. In the evenings, Arthur and I worked together to compile a medical decline log. He flipped through an old notebook, showing me how to backdate entries so it appeared the deterioration had begun well before the cruise. October 10th, shortness of breath at night, oxygen level increased. October 23rd, morning medication skipped because Elaine forgot to buy it. November 5th, severe stomach pain, no one home. I typed up a clean copy, printed it, and clipped it into a folder labeled Medical Decline. Everything was stored in duplicate, hard copies in a locked cabinet, and encrypted files on an external drive. Arthur was meticulous, like a chief accountant, and I began to see why he had kept his assets intact for so long. When everything was ready, Arthur picked up the landline and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Patricia, I need to see you. As soon as possible." I heard a firm, low female voice on the other end. Arthur summarized the situation, leaving out nothing about his illness, the family's trip, and my presence there. "Tomorrow," Patricia replied crisply. "I will bring will templates and the necessary documents. We will begin immediately." When he hung up, Arthur leaned back against his pillow, looking at me. "The wheel is already in motion, Lucas. We cannot stop it now." That night, as I adjusted the fake pacemaker at his bedside, I realized I had crossed a line. From someone abandoned, I had become part of a plan whose end I could not fully predict. But in Arthur's eyes, I saw one thing clearly: the determination to make sure those who had left him behind would not walk away without consequence. Patricia arrived on a gray morning, wearing a charcoal wool coat and carrying a thick leather briefcase. She nodded to me as she stepped inside, then bent to shake Arthur's hand with a rare kind of respect. "We have a lot to get through and not much time," she said plainly, setting the case down on the dining table. Arthur motioned for me to bring the folder in the leather notebook we had prepared. Patricia opened her laptop and logged into a professional financial management program. "I will start with the bank and investment accounts," she said. "Arthur, I'll need your login information." He read out each account number and password. Soon the screen filled with transaction histories, and within minutes, I saw exactly what Arthur had hinted at. Withdrawals of $3,000, $5,000, even $8,200, marked as medical expenses or home maintenance, but with no matching invoices. Patricia scanned through the months. Almost every month has something suspicious. And she stopped, clicking on a large transfer from over a year ago. This one, $40,000, moved from Arthur's joint account to an account in the name of Margaret Lowell. I felt the blood drain from my face. Margaret Lowell. That's Claire's mother. I turned to Arthur, looking for an explanation. He held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "I know. When it happened, Elaine told me it was a short-term loan to help Claire handle a family matter. I suspected, but at the time, I didn't know where the money had come from. I gripped the arms of my chair. It came from Mia, so that was all my father left me. Claire convinced me to put it into the joint account to buy a house. My voice sounded rough and cold in my ears. Patricia looked up, her expression sharpening. If you have any documentation proving the source of those funds, we can include it in the record. This is an undocumented transfer with no repayment. Arthur folded his arms, his eyes dark. You see, Lucas, they've been doing the same thing to me for years. This didn't just start. He told us about when Claire's biological father was alive, a quiet man who owned a small repair shop. After marrying Elaine, he sold the shop and deposited most of the money into their joint account. In less than 3 years, it was gone, spent on vacations, designer clothes, and a kitchen remodel largely justified as increasing resale value. When he died, Claire was 19, and Elaine inherited everything. History just repeats itself, Arthur said, his voice even but bitter. This time with you and me. Patricia closed her laptop, stacked the printed statements, and marked the questionable transactions. Now we need a recorded statement from Arthur himself. When they come back, no one will be able to say you were coerced or not of sound mind. I set up my camera using the big living room window to light Arthur's face clearly, with no shadows to hide him. He sat in the armchair, wearing a dark sweater, his silver hair slightly mussed, the worn leather notebook in his hand. When the camera began recording, he spoke slowly, each word distinct. I, Arthur Jameson, am of sound mind as I make this statement. Over the past several years, I have been neglected by my wife and stepchildren, had my medications reduced, and been exploited financially. He listed each incident, dates, events, the people involved. March 14th, morning medication skipped because Elaine said the doctor overprescribed. September 5th, fell in the yard, no one home, neighbor had to help. July 12th, $8,200 withdrawn from my account, with no invoice or related purchase. His voice did not shake. His eyes stayed fixed on the lens, as if he meant to pierce through it. The reason I am changing my will is that they no longer act as family. They see me as a burden to be managed, not as a human being deserving of respect. I leave my estate to Lucas Grant, the only one here when I needed someone, and to the Elder Protection Fund to prevent what has happened to me from happening to others. When he finished, I switched off the camera, the air in the room feeling heavy. Patricia nodded, clear, coherent, and undeniable. We'll store at least 3 copies in 3 separate places. We moved to the dining table where Patricia spread out a thick stack of papers. This is the draft of the new will. All real estate, investments, and cash will be transferred into a trust managed by Lucas. The trust will allocate 60% to Lucas, 40% to the Elder Protection Fund, and similar organizations. Elaine and Brady are excluded entirely, with a note explaining why. Arthur read every page, squinting at the legal phrasing, but missing nothing. I wanted added clearly that Lucas's $40,000 will be repaid directly from the Colorado Springs property before the trust is distributed, he said. Patricia nodded and wrote it in blue ink. Next came the property and medical power of attorney. Patricia explained, if your condition worsens before everything is finalized, Lucas will have the authority to act on your behalf, close accounts, sell assets, sign contracts, without waiting for court approval. Arthur signed each page, his hand steady. When all the signatures were done, Patricia packed up the documents, a trace of relief in her eyes. The hardest part will be filing and certifying these before they get back, but we're at least one step ahead. Arthur leaned back, exhaling a long breath. The wheel's already in motion, he said, repeating the words he told me days earlier. This time, though, his voice was lighter, as if some of the weight had finally shifted. I looked at him, then at the stack of files on the table, each sheet a fragment of the truth they had tried to hide. In my mind, the image of Claire and her mother laughing on the cruise deck blurred into the sight of Arthur's signature beneath the words disinheritance clause. For the first time in years, I felt the balance begin to tip in my favor. Arthur died on a quiet morning, when the first light of day slipped through the curtains and settled on his face, serene in its stillness. I sat beside his bed, my hand wrapped around his until it cooled completely. There were no suiting, no theatrics, only an unusual peace, as though Arthur had tied up every loose end before letting go. 3 days later, I held a small funeral in the backyard. A few close neighbors came, the ones who had helped Arthur in better days, along with a handful of old friends he still spoke to over the phone. The air was hushed, broken only by the wind sweeping through the trees and the faint creak of wooden chairs as people shifted in their seats. I placed his framed photograph on a long wooden table beside a vase of white chrysanthemums, which a neighbor had brought. Claire's family returned from their Caribbean cruise that same afternoon. They rolled their suitcases across the concrete, their bright summer clothes clashing against the subdued air of a service that had already ended. Claire looked around, her eyes scanning as if searching for someone, until they landed on me. "Why didn't you call?" Her voice shook, but it carried more irritation than grief. Her mother's brow furrowed, as if she'd been personally wronged. "You let us miss his final moments." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I went inside, opened Arthur's desk drawer, and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. Back in the living room where they had all gathered, I broke the seal in front of them. "This is Arthur's letter, written to all of you," I said slowly. I began to read. His voice seemed to echo in my head as I spoke the words, so vivid it felt as if he were sitting somewhere in the room, watching. He wrote about the years of neglect, the times he'd been left to fend for himself after falling, the evenings when dinner was nothing more than stale crackers. He recounted the medications that had been cut, the money withdrawn from his accounts without his consent. And then he explained the true reason for changing his will, because his blood had chosen to leave him when he needed them most, while the man they had treated as an outsider stayed until his last breath. When I finished, no one spoke. I opened my laptop, connected it to the television, and played the video Arthur had recorded a few weeks earlier. In it, he sat in his armchair, his voice weaker, but his gaze unflinching. He recounted in detail every abandonment, every unexplained withdrawal, including the $40,000 of mine he had discovered had been borrowed into Claire's mother's account the year before. He didn't raise his voice or accuse. He simply stated the facts like a final report. Next, I placed a thick bundle of files on the table, bound with cloth ties. I untied it, letting the stacks of papers slide free. Bank statements, photographs of Arthur's bruises when after the fall, no one responded to, and recordings of phone calls where I reported him critical, only to be met with indifference. Statements from neighbors describing the afternoons they'd seen him sitting alone on the porch, waiting for someone who never came. From the corner of the room, Patricia, Arthur's lawyer, stood with a blue folder in hand. Her voice was firm and precise. "This is Arthur's most recent will, legally binding, drafted and notarized before his death. It states that his entire estate, including the Colorado Springs property, bank accounts, and investments, will be divided into two parts, half to Lucas Grant and half to the Elder Protection Fund, to be managed directly by Lucas." I heard Claire's mother exhale sharply. She shot to her feet, rifling through the will as if hunting for a flaw. But the documents were airtight, complete with signatures, seals, and the recorded signing session. Patricia continued, "In addition, this house and all associated living accounts will belong to the fund. Lucas Grant retains management and full decision-making authority." Silence fell over the room. No one could contest it. I saw in their faces a cocktail of shock, anger, and helplessness. No one left that day. How could they, when this had once been their assumed domain? But the atmosphere had shifted. They no longer moved freely through the house, opened the fridge, or switched on the TV as if by right. The papers on the table had rewritten the rules. I gathered the documents in the will, locked them in the safe Arthur had left me, turning the key he'd placed in my palm one pale afternoon. The sound of the lock clicking shut was not victory. It was completion. The circle closed. I looked out the window toward the mountains bathed in the gold of a setting sun. Inside, the wall clock ticked steadily, marking the truth that time waits for no one, and that every story, no matter how bitter or quiet, must someday find its end. In the days following the reading of the will, the house slowly settled into the quiet rhythm Arthur had always preferred. Claire's family stayed for exactly one more week, clearing their belongings from the upstairs rooms. I did not say much, keeping just enough distance for them to understand that everything was over. Claire's gaze no longer carried the sharp edge it once had, but there was still bitterness there. Not for the loss of a father, but for the loss of control over a place they had once assumed was theirs. When the last SUV carried them down the maple-lined road toward the highway, I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Silence settled in, broken only by the wind sweeping over the roof and the sparrows chattering along the wooden fence. For the first time in months, the air here felt like it truly belonged to me. The next day, I began tackling the things Arthur had mentioned so many times but never had the chance to do. I called a maintenance company to repair the roof, replace rotted boards, and repaint the entire front. The front door was polished, and a new sign was hung, reading clearly, Elder Protection Fund, Colorado Springs office. Patricia helped me open a separate account for the fund, completely independent from my assets. Together, we reviewed its operating guidelines to ensure every dollar would be used exactly as intended, to support elderly people who had been abandoned or exploited. Arthur was gone, but I wanted him to see, from wherever he was, that his wishes had been carried out in full. The work of the fund began with small steps. In the first week, we helped an 82-year-old man whose son had taken his pension. Next, a widowed woman needed her leaking roof fixed before the rainy season. Each story reminded me of Arthur, not in the tragedy, but in the way they maintained their dignity, even after being abandoned by those closest to them. I also devoted time to tending the backyard garden. Under the old oak, I placed a wooden bench with a small brass plaque engraved, Arthur Bennett, A Life of Resolve. In the mornings, I often brought coffee there, reading through the medical logs we had once kept for our plan. Now, those entries were no longer legal evidence, but memories of the time Arthur and I worked in step, preparing piece by piece to turn the tables. One late autumn afternoon, a package arrived at the fund's office. Inside was an old pocket watch, its face faded but the hand still moving. There was no letter, only a scrap of paper with the words, "To keep time pointed in the right direction." I did not know who sent it, but deep down I wanted to believe it was a message from Arthur. That winter, I joined a kayaking course at the lake near town. At first, it was simply for fitness, but soon I was drawn to the freedom of cutting through the water, the gentle slap of waves against the hull. I realized I was not just refreshing my life. I was stepping out from under 7 years of being dismissed and constrained. Every time I came home, I passed through the living room where Arthur's photograph still hung neatly on the wall. I often stopped and met his calm gaze in the picture. Without saying a word, I knew he would be pleased with how things were unfolding. Not loud, not bitter, just clear and resolute. On the first anniversary of Arthur's death, I hosted a small gathering. It was not a funeral or an official event, just neighbors, Arthur's old friends, and a few people the fund had helped. We sat around a long table, ate the chicken soup Arthur used to make, and shared lighthearted stories about him. Some recalled his chess games, others the time he insisted on fixing the chicken coop roof in the middle of a rainstorm. Every laugh that night felt like a declaration. His memory was no longer tied to neglect, but to warmth and resolve. When everyone left, I stood alone in the yard, watching the street lamps cast a gold glow across the thin layer of snow. I remembered something Arthur had told me on a summer night when we had just begun our plan. They think you are just a doorman, but I know you are the one holding the key. At the time, I did not fully understand. Now, I knew he had not just been talking about this house. He meant the way I would unlock a new life for myself. I never reached out to Claire or her family again. Not out of spite, but because I had learned a lesson Arthur had paid for with his whole life. No one is worth returning to once the foundation of respect is gone. The fund continued to grow, the house became a refuge for those in need, and I, naturally, became the one to tell their stories. The following spring, I decided to turn the small back room into a woodworking shop. There, I built long benches to give to elderly families in town, people who still enjoyed sitting on their porches in the afternoon. On each bench, I attached a small plate engraved with Arthur's favorite phrase, "Respect is the only foundation that cannot be bought back." The work, the kayak trips, and the afternoons in the workshop filled the space I had once tried to patch with the remnants of a marriage long since rotted. I realized I was no longer living for Arthur or the fund. but for myself, a version of me no longer compared, controlled, and no longer asking permission to exist as I am. A year and a half after Arthur's death, I received an invitation from the city council offering to present me with a community award for contributions to the elderly. I did not care about the title, but when I stood on the stage to accept it, I looked toward the audience and imagined Arthur sitting there, arms crossed, wearing that quiet, proud smile. On the way home, I passed the lake. The water shimmered with the same sunset light as the first evening I had paddled far from shore. I stopped, taking in a deep breath. I had come a long way from a doorman in the eyes of others to the keeper of a legacy, a fund, and a new life. And it had all begun the day I chose silence, but prepared so well that when I finally spoke, no one could deny the truth. I once thought that victory meant seeing the betrayer on their knees, asking for forgiveness, or at least watching them face consequences right before my eyes. But in the end, I realized true victory was much quieter. It was in the mornings when I stepped into the kitchen, brewed a cup of coffee in a house where no one had the right to command me. It was in the smiles of the elderly supported by the fund, in the wordless gratitude shining in their eyes. Claire never called again. I never tried to hear news about them either. Not because I wanted to erase the memory, but because I understood that once the line of respect is crossed, there is no road back. We can patch a roof, replace fallen bricks, but when the foundation has collapsed, everything built upon it is nothing but sinking sand. I keep Arthur's final letter in the drawer of my desk. Not to read every day, but to remind myself that silence does not mean surrender. Silence is the shield that protects you from acting in haste, the time to organize evidence, choose your allies, and wait for the right moment. When you are ready, you will not need to shout for someone to believe you. The evidence will speak for itself. Once, a middle-aged woman came to the fund, telling me her son had used her name to take out a loan, then left her with the crushing debt. She said, "I do not know whether I should forgive or fight," I told her. "Forgiveness is your right, but protecting yourself is your duty. And sometimes the best way to forgive is to never let them have the chance to hurt you again." Looking back, I see that my life after Arthur was no longer confined by resentment or the need to prove anything to anyone. I only needed to live according to the values I chose. And that is something Claire's family will never be able to take away, just as they will never again step foot in this house. I want to leave anyone listening to this story with one thing. Know how to set boundaries and protect your values. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can control whether they ever have the chance to do it a second time. And if one day you must speak, let every word be supported by preparation and truth. Then you will not need to shout. You will only need to say it once, and silence will do the rest.